The snow had begun to fall sideways, thick and mean, when the westbound train hissed and moaned into the Hollow Bluff station. It didn't stop long. Trains rarely did. They dropped off who they had to and left again, whistles screaming through the pine-split silence, indifferent to what they left behind. She stepped down last. A woman in a torn calico coat too thin for the season, sleeves soaked through, hands bare and red as if she'd begged the conductor to let her ride in the back with the coal. Her hair, a matted honey brown, stuck to her cheeks. One side of her face was bruised purple, blooming across her cheekbone. She carried nothing. No valise. No name spoken. Just stepped onto the icy wood platform and stood like someone unsure if the earth would hold. No one helped her. The station master, old Briggs, leaned out from behind his window and muttered something about types like that. A pair of sisters in wool shawls tugged their children closer, whispering behind gloves. A preacher's wife turned her head as if God himself had asked her not to see. She should have collapsed. Her legs trembled like saplings. But something in her, something quiet and unwilling to give the crowd satisfaction, kept her upright. A man moved. Not from the crowd, but from beyond it. From the far edge of the station, where the snow piled like memory. He had been standing near the telegraph post, watching from beneath a white buffalo hide coat. No hat, no horse, no companions. Just stillness. Like a figure carved from the winter itself. Tall, half a head taller than any man nearby. Shoulders broad and square, hair braided back and tied with rawhide cord. He moved like snowfall, silent and unhurried, and walked straight to her. No one said his name, but everyone knew it. Bowden Greyhawk. A Comanche man, born from silence and known for staying that way. Lived somewhere north, off the high ridge where the deer didn't come anymore. Some said he'd been a scout for the army. Others said he never served a soul but his own lost ones. He rarely came to town unless the snow threatened his supplies or unless something called him. And something had. She looked up at him, flinching not from fear but from habit. Her lips parted, maybe to speak, maybe to apologize for taking up space. But he was already removing his coat. He placed it around her shoulders, not gently, but solidly. Like he was restoring her to the world. She whispered, "You don't know me." His voice came low and firm, "You're coming with me." No demand. No question. Just a truth that sounded strange in a place where most men only spoke when they wanted something. She should have refused. Should have said no, or asked where, or reminded him she wasn't his responsibility. But the coat was warm. And his eyes, black as coal, but soft as ash, held no hunger, no pity. Just presence. The kind of presence that doesn't pull, doesn't push, just stays. She nodded. Briggs grunted from behind the glass, scratching something in his ledger. She got a name, he barked at Bowden. He didn't answer. Only held her arm and guided her toward a buckboard wagon half buried in snow. The mule hitched to it, stomped once, restless. The crowd didn't follow. They only watched. As if witnessing a strange, quiet miracle they weren't sure they approved of. Inside the wagon, Bowden handed her a blanket. She didn't ask where they were going. Maybe because it didn't matter. Maybe because when you've already been thrown away, any road that isn't backward feels like salvation. The wind howled through the bare trees as they rode. For a long time, the only sound was the sleigh runners over frozen dirt and the shifting snow in the pines. He didn't ask her anything. Didn't demand her story like so many others had. She found herself looking at his hands, scarred but still. The hands of someone who'd worked, fought, and maybe prayed. After a while, she spoke. Voice dry as a paper cut. "My name's Emma." He nodded once. She waited, then added, "He hit me at the last stop." Said I embarrassed him. His brow didn't twitch. But he adjusted the reins in one hand and said, "You're not with him now." Silence again. Not cold. Not sharp. Just simple. The kind of silence you could rest in. Snow thickened. Branches bowed under the weight. Dusk came early, painting the sky a muted pewter. She began to shake, not from cold, but from whatever storm still lived in her bones. At the next bend, the wagon creaked up a rise. There, tucked into the rock's shadow, sat a cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. A dog barked once from somewhere behind it. The place wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. But it stood, and it burned light into the dark, and the porch was clear of snow. He helped her down without touching her skin. Inside, the cabin was warmer than she expected. Firelight licked the log walls. A pot of stew simmered. There were 2 chairs. A table. A Bible worn at the corners. A carving of a bird in flight above the hearth. She stood there like a ghost, unsure if it could haunt. He lit a second lantern and gestured toward the bedroom door. "That room's yours. If you want it." She hesitated. Then whispered, "You don't want to know what happened?" He met her eyes. "You're here. That's enough." She turned from him, then, slowly, as if she might vanish before reaching the door, and stepped into the bedroom. He didn't follow. Only once she'd closed the door behind her did she allow herself to weep. But the walls didn't echo it back. And in the outer room, the man who had offered her no questions and no price added another log to the fire, sat down in his chair, and kept watch. Outside, the snow curled down like pages turning slow. Covering what was lost. Burying what didn't need remembering. And in that hush, deeper than words, something small but unbreakable had begun again. And though neither of them knew it yet, the woman once discarded like soot, and the man carved out of quiet, were about to teach the town what warmth really meant. The first morning came with frost laced on the inside of the windows, and Emma stirred before the light had reached the ridgeline. The room was quiet, smelling of dry pine and something warm, cornbread, maybe. Her fingers, stiff from sleep, touched the heavy quilt that had covered her through the night. It wasn't hers. Nothing here was hers. And yet, for the first time in months, her bruises weren't the first thing she remembered upon waking. She rose without noise, careful not to disturb the stillness. When she stepped into the main room, Bowden was already by the fire, crouched low, feeding kindling to the coals. He didn't glance up. She stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to speak or retreat. Then he said, low and even, "There's hot water by the stove." Emma nodded, moving slowly, like she was stepping through someone else's home, someone else's life. A tin mug waited on the table beside a small clay pot. Steam coiled from it like breath. She poured herself a cup and held it in both hands, grateful for the burn. Grateful to be holding something that didn't hurt back. He didn't speak more. Didn't ask about the marks on her arms or the broken rhythm in her voice. He simply stood, stirred the fire again, and moved to the corner where a basket of chopped wood waited to be refilled. There were no eyes on her. No curiosity. Just the sound of the fire breathing, the wind gnawing at the windows, and the calm, steady motion of a man who asked nothing. It was strange how loud peace could be. By midday, she'd wandered outside. The snow had crusted over in places, crunching underfoot. The air was sharp enough to sting. But the silence here was different from the silence in town. There, it was heavy with judgment, eyes behind curtains, names muttered like curses. Here, it was something cleaner, thin air, pine needles whispering overhead, the distant caw of a raven circling wide. She found the stream just past the chicken coop, frozen over except for a narrow trickle running fast beneath the surface. She crouched and touched it, just to feel something moving that hadn't been bruised or broken. Bowden watched her from the porch. Not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to forget her. That night, she left her boots by the hearth and took a brush from her satchel, one of the few things she'd held onto. She tugged the knots from her hair with slow, painful strokes, tears leaking silently as she worked. He sat at the table, carving a piece of wood with a small hunting knife, never looking up. And still, he didn't ask. It became a rhythm, days layered like blankets. She helped chop vegetables for the stew. He split wood without grunting or complaint. She swept the floor. He oiled the door hinges. Neither of them filled the air with unnecessary words. And yet, something between them grew not like fire, sudden and consuming, but like a root taking hold beneath hard earth. On the fourth night, she found a clean cotton dress folded on her bed. A simple one, dove gray, high-collared, with small wooden buttons. No note. No signature. But it was not new. Worn at the hem. Likely someone's memory once. She didn't ask who it had belonged to. She wore it the next morning anyway. At breakfast, Bowden nodded once. Fits. She smiled. Her first real one. Small. Fragile. But real. Later that day, a knock came at the cabin door. Not the wind. Not a deer brushing past. A firm, human knock. Bowden opened it without flinching. On the other side stood a stout woman with graying black braids tucked under a wool shawl and eyes sharp enough to slice leather. "Mabel," Bowden said, stepping aside. The woman swept in like she owned the snow. "You finally let someone live in that guest room," she said, setting a small basket on the table. Emma blinked, unsure if she was being addressed or inspected. "I'm Mabel," the woman continued. "Midwife. Bread maker. Bringer of news and warnings." Bowden gave Emma a look that might have been amusement, his version of a chuckle. Mabel turned toward her. "You're the girl from the station." Emma stiffened. "Relax," Mabel said. "I saw what the town didn't want to. You survived something. Good. Now eat this." She handed over a small, warm loaf, its crust still soft. "Cornbread makes healing faster." Emma took it with a whisper of thanks. Mabel sat for tea, talked mostly to Bowden, but glanced at Emma often, not unkindly, just reading her like someone flipping through a well-worn Bible. Before she left, she looked Emma in the eye and said, "He's quiet." "Not stupid. If you're running from something, say so before it finds you. He can't help if he don't know." Emma's voice came softer than snow. "It's not chasing me. Not anymore." Mabel raised an eyebrow, nodded once, and disappeared into the snow. That night, Emma found herself by the fire, hands curled around a bowl of soup she hadn't helped cook. The silence stretched again, not lonely, just wide. She finally said, "You don't ask me anything." Bowden didn't look up from the blade he was sharpening. "Would you answer?" "No," she admitted. "Then it don't matter." She looked at him for a long time. His eyes were fixed on the steel, but there was no sharpness in him. Only focus. Patience. "I was married," she said at last. "To a man who didn't like to be looked at wrong. He said I made him feel small." Bowden paused. Set down the blade. "He was right," she said, voice trembling. "Because he was." He said nothing, only leaned forward and placed another log on the fire. The flames leapt in response. "I thought maybe, if I just stayed quiet long enough, he'd stop." She swallowed. "He didn't." Bowden met her eyes. "He won't find you here." She nodded. But her hands still trembled. He stood, crossed the room, and took down a wool blanket from the shelf. Handed it to her without touching her skin. "Snow's deeper tonight. Keep warm." She held the blanket close, not just for heat, but for what it meant. As she turned to retreat to her room, he spoke again. "You don't owe anyone your story." She stopped. "But you deserve a place to finish it." She didn't cry, not then. She only nodded, closed the door behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed with the blanket wrapped around her like a truth she could finally believe in. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, testing the walls, but not breaking them. Inside, the silence had changed shape. It no longer asked her to hide. It asked her to stay. The first time Emma stepped into Hollow Bluff, the snow had melted just enough to reveal the hard-packed dirt of the main road and the rot beneath the town's polished manners. The town stood in the fold between two ridges, painted up in false civility, whitewashed church, brick-faced bank, a saloon with polished windows, but every building leaned slightly inward, as if listening for scandal. Bowden had told her they needed cloth, lamp oil, and horseshoe nails. Supplies couldn't be ignored, no matter how kind the quiet at home had grown. She'd offered to stay behind, but he only looked at her and said, "You're not a ghost." So she dressed in the dove-gray gown and tied her hair back in a braid. The bruises on her cheek had faded to the color of smoke. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror by the cabin door and didn't see shame, not yet dignity, but something raw and halfway between. They rode in together. Hollow Bluff did not welcome her. Children stopped mid-play. A woman dropped a sack of potatoes at the corner of the feed store. Two old men on a bench outside the telegraph office froze mid-chest move. It wasn't just that she was with a Comanche man. It was that they knew her and knew where she'd come from, what she'd run from, what had been whispered about her under church rafters and in tavern corners. Lula Cray was the first to speak. She stepped out of her saloon, arms folded across a red velvet bodice. Her eyes were sharp and unkind, a smirk stretched across her powdered face. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," Lula called, voice high enough for everyone to hear. "Emma Callahan, back from the dead. Or just crawled out of someone else's bed?" Emma didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She only held her spine straight and her chin a little higher. But her hands curled against the reins. Bowden's presence loomed beside her. Still. Unmoved. But his gaze found Lula and held long enough for the woman to shift her weight. They dismounted outside the general store. Bowden stepped in first, wordless. Emma followed, heat rising up her throat. Inside, it was worse. Faces turned. Conversations halted. The owner, a wiry man named Greeley, smiled too wide and too false. "Didn't expect to see you, Miss Callahan," he said, dusting off a shelf that didn't need dusting. "Thought you'd left town for good." Emma reached for a spool of thread. "I did." Greeley cleared his throat. "Well, things change, I suppose." She didn't reply. She moved from shelf to shelf, gathering what was needed. The stares followed her like flies. One woman murmured the word shameless. Another, louder, "A girl like that shouldn't be living with a man like him." She dropped the tin of lamp oil. It clanged against the wooden floor, rolled once, then stopped at Bowden's feet. He picked it up and placed it in the basket without a word. When they reached the counter, Sheriff Elmore Wade walked in. His boots tracked fresh mud across the threshold, his silver star catching what little light crept through the front windows. His gaze went straight to Bowden. "Greyhawk," he said. "Didn't expect to see you dragging company into town." Bowden didn't blink. "We need supplies." The sheriff turned to Emma. His smile was tight as boot leather. "Ma'am, I heard you were staying out near the ridge. That true?" Emma nodded. "You been staying in his home?" "Yes." The sheriff scratched the back of his neck. "You aware your husband never signed a formal annulment or divorce filing?" "My husband," she said, her voice trembling like a taut wire, "put his boot on my neck and left me bleeding outside a depot." Wade shifted, uneasy. "I'm just saying, folks'll talk." "Let them," Bowden said, voice low and firm. "Man's got rights, Greyhawk." "And she has more," he replied. The store went quiet. Even Greeley stopped pretending to count coins. Emma felt the weight of every breath in that room. She was not supposed to answer back. She was supposed to lower her gaze, apologize for surviving, maybe beg. But instead, she placed the coin for the thread on the counter herself. "I'm not going back to him." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "The law's not on your side, Miss Callahan." Bowden stepped forward. "Not threatening. Just present." "She is." That was all he said. Sheriff Wade held his stare for a beat longer, then stepped aside. "Watch yourself out there." They left the store with quiet dignity, the basket of goods balanced between them. As they passed the church, Emma could see the preacher's wife in the window, shaking her head. At the schoolhouse, a teacher stood with folded arms, lips pressed tight. The town's judgment wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, pressed into every glance, every whisper, every unspoken invitation to disappear. Once they reached the wagon, Bowden helped her up without speaking. They rode out in silence, wheels crunching over gravel, the sky above them heavy with gray cloud and coming snow. Halfway home, Emma broke. "I was nothing to them," she whispered. "Even before Josiah. I could have died at that station and they wouldn't have moved." Bowden didn't answer right away. Then he said, "The town's afraid of seeing itself. So it turns away." She turned toward him, voice shaking. "Why did you come to get me?" His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Because I saw you." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not loud, not heaving. Just clean. Like something being washed out of her. "You stood there," she said, "and they all just watched me fall." "I know." She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. "They want me to feel like I should have stayed beaten. You didn't." The wind rose, blowing snow in gusts across the path. They rode through it, side by side, without speaking again until the cabin rose into view between the trees. Emma climbed down on her own. She carried the basket inside, unpacked it in the small kitchen nook, then lit the lamp with slow, practiced hands. The flame steadied and burned. Later, after supper, as Bowden carved another small wooden figure, she sat beside him instead of across. She didn't touch him. Just sat close enough for silence to feel like something shared. And though she didn't say it aloud, part of her knew. Hollow Bluff might never open its eyes. Might never make room for her name to be spoken kindly. But in this home, with this man, she wasn't invisible. She was seen. And that was the beginning of something worth staying for. The snow had begun to melt along the ridge, dripping from the cabin's eaves in quiet rivulets. Winter hadn't ended, but it had softened, like a hard man setting down his weapon. Days stretched longer now. The wind had lost its bite, though its breath still whispered through the pines. Emma woke to birdsong again, thin, tentative, but present. She spent her mornings tending the soil beside the porch, where the earth had begun to loosen its frozen grip. She worked barehanded, feeling dirt crumble beneath her nails, planting rosemary, onions, and memory. Her fingers, once clenched in defense, now shaped things meant to grow. It startled her, the quiet joy of it. Bowden watched without hovering. He patched the shed roof. Mended a saddle strap. Hauled logs down from the ridge. But often, as he passed, he would pause and glance toward her, not long, not possessive. Just long enough for her to feel seen again, and this time, without shame. One evening, a storm rolled in. Not snow this time, but rain, cold, silver, steady. The roof hummed with it. Emma lit a lantern and brought in the wash before it soaked through. She found Bowden on the porch, his shoulders already wet, staring out like a man listening for something far away. She stepped beside him, hands tucked in her shawl. "You expecting someone?" He shook his head slowly. "Just remembering a sound." They stood like that for a while, the rain drumming above, the earth drinking below. She looked at his hands, rough, wide, calloused, and realized she no longer flinched when he reached for things near her. Once, the movement of any man's arm had drawn her inward like a frightened deer. But not his. His hands were a language. They asked. Never demanded. "I used to dream of this," she murmured. Not the storm, but the quiet inside it. He turned to her slightly. "You dream now?" She nodded. "Sometimes. Less of running. More of staying." That night, she set a bowl of stew before him and watched him eat, his motion slow, deliberate. She sat across, chewing in silence, her knees nearly touching his beneath the table. Outside, the fire crackled against the hearthstone, and the shadows danced with a rhythm older than either of them. After supper, he sat by the hearth, carving again. A long sliver of pine curled beneath his knife as he worked. She sat near him, spinning thread between her fingers, neither of them speaking, until she noticed what he'd made. A horse. Small. Plain. Rough around the edges, but balanced, crafted with a certain reverence, like it had weight beyond wood. He held it out to her without a word. She took it in both hands, her thumb brushing the smooth arc of its back. Her voice cracked. "You carved this?" He nodded. "For me?" "I made it for the first thing I knew you'd hold without fear." Her fingers closed around it. Her throat tightened. She stood without speaking, walked to her room, and returned with a bundle of yarn sun-bleached blue. She tied a bit of it around the horse's neck like a halter, then placed it carefully on the mantel. Bowden watched her, quiet as always. That night, she didn't retreat to her bedroom. Instead, after the lamps were snuffed and the fire burned low, she brought her quilt from the spare room and laid it near his hearth. He stirred in his chair but didn't speak. She lay beside the warmth, her breath slow, hands folded beneath her cheek. "I'm not afraid of you," she said into the dark. "I know." She didn't need more. The silence between them stretched wide and soft, a silence that held rather than excluded. In the following days, the thaw deepened. Emma found herself humming while she worked. She cleaned the window panes, not for duty, but for light. She aired the bedding and beat the rugs until the dust of a former life flew out and disappeared into the trees. One afternoon, while fetching water, she slipped on a patch of ice beneath the pump. She let out a cry, more surprised than hurt. Bowden was there before she stood, his hand out, steady, palm open. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. Their eyes met. He didn't pull. He didn't tighten. Just helped her upright with the same patience he'd offered the first day, back at the station. But this time, she didn't let go quickly. Later that week, Mabel returned. She brought a tin of honey, 3 fresh eggs, and a look that said she'd come to inspect. Emma poured her tea and sat with her by the table while Bowden chopped wood outside. Mabel stirred her drink, eyes flicking toward the closed door. "So," she said, "has the cabin stopped feeling borrowed?" Emma smiled softly. "It's quieter in my bones." Mabel leaned back in her chair. "That man's been alone a long time. He don't say much, but he listens deeper than most preachers." "I know. Do you?" Emma looked down at her hands, roughened now, with dirt in her nail beds and small cuts from branches. "He lets me find myself without watching." Mabel nodded. "Then don't waste it." "Most women get men who shape them into what suits their pride. You got one who leaves space." The words settled. When Mabel left, she hugged Emma not like a visitor, but like someone who'd finally been satisfied with what she saw. That night, Emma sat beside Bowden by the fire, knitting while he polished his knife. After a long while, she asked, "Why me?" He didn't look up. "You didn't need saving. You needed stillness." She reached out, her hand settling on his forearm. The first time she'd touched him without fear. His skin was warm, the muscle beneath it solid, still. "And what did you need?" she asked. He turned to her slowly. "Someone who wouldn't leave just because the world told her to." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not fragile. Not weak. Just tired of resisting something kind." And he let her rest there. 4 minutes. 4 hours. For as long as she needed. Outside, the snow continued to melt, not in torrents, but in slow, patient rivulets. The pine needles dripped like they were waking from a long sleep. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, life stirred in burrows and nests. Things that had endured the freeze now breathed easier. And inside that cabin, her hands remembered warmth. Not from a fire. Not from a gift. But from being held, not by a man's grip, but by his quiet. And neither of them said it aloud, but something had shifted. What they'd built wasn't safety. It was beginning. The snow came back sharp, late in the season, as if winter had one final word to speak. It fell thick and heavy, smothering the thaw in silence, and the pines bent low beneath the weight. The world was white again. But something in Emma had changed too deeply to be covered. She stood on the porch, eyes watching the tree lean, hands gripping the railing. Her shawl fluttered at her shoulders, and her breath came slow and even. Inside, the fire crackled, and the stew simmered. Outside, something old and unfinished rode toward them on borrowed time. Bowden emerged behind her, his axe slung low and his eyes steady. "He's coming," Emma said. "I know." They'd heard it that morning, hoofbeats too fast for hunting, too slow for trade. A stallion, likely black, likely bitter. And the way the wind bent before it, as if the storm were following a man. Josiah Pike. Her husband by paper, if not by heart. By bruises, if not by vows. The man who had once called her wife between curses, who had left her at a train station bleeding and alone. Who now, it seemed, wanted her back not for love, but for pride. A woman who walked away was one thing. A woman who thrived away was another. Emma had known this day would come. She'd felt it in the way the wind changed direction that morning, smelled it in the pine, tasted it in the air. And when Mabel had come that afternoon with her rifle slung beneath her coat and no reason offered, she hadn't even asked why. "He'll have others," Bowden said. "Let him." They didn't pack. Didn't run. Bowden moved the horse to the barn and scattered snow over the firewood trail. Emma swept the hearth. Mabel loaded her rifle and sat by the window, her braid tucked tight and her eyes sharp. "They'll expect fear," she muttered. "Give them stillness." The first shot came as a warning up into the pine, cracking branch and silence. Emma didn't flinch. A moment later, the cabin door shook with a fist. "Emma!" That voice. She hadn't heard it in months, but it still lived under her skin. It sounded just as she remembered, hard, bitter, laced with liquor and wounded pride. Josiah never missed a chance to sound like the victim. "You come out here now. I got the sheriff with me." Bowden didn't move. His knife remained on the table. His breath was calm. Mabel clicked the safety off her rifle. "He's bluffing." Another voice followed, Sheriff Wade. "Emma Callahan, you open this door. This man's your legal husband. You've been living improper under Comanche roof." Emma stepped forward. Her hands didn't tremble. She opened the door herself. Snow blew in like smoke. 3 men stood in the yard. Josiah at the front, red-faced and reeking of rage. Sheriff Wade beside him, jaw clenched. A third man, unfamiliar, hovered behind them, holding a rifle and looking uncomfortable. Emma stepped out onto the porch. "You're not welcome here," she said. "You're my wife," Josiah barked. "The whole damn town knows it. You've been playing settler girl with that," his eyes cut to Bowden, red devil in the woods. Sheriff Wade raised a hand, uneasy. "Emma, we can settle this peaceful. Come back with him. It'll end all this." "I'd rather freeze in that ravine," she said flatly. Bowden stepped into view behind her, not to speak, just to stand. His silence, as always, held more weight than most men's shouts. Josiah's eyes narrowed. "You think he'll protect you? This savage?" "No," she said. "I protect myself now." He reached for his pistol. But Bowden was faster. He didn't draw. He didn't shout. He stepped off the porch, walked into the snow, and stopped just out of reach. "You want her," Bowden said, his voice low, "you go through me." Josiah scoffed. "You think you scare me?" Mabel opened the window behind them, rifle steady against the ledge. "I think I do," she said. The third man stepped back. Josiah hesitated. "You beat her," Bowden said, voice quieter now. "You left her for dead. And now you want her back, not because you love her, but because someone else gave her peace." Josiah's face burned. "She's mine." "No," Emma said. "I was never yours. You broke what you couldn't own." Wade shifted his weight. "This ain't the law's way." "The law," Mabel snapped, "turns its eyes when a woman bleeds and calls it order." The wind howled. Bowden took one more step forward. "This land doesn't belong to the old rules anymore." Josiah raised his pistol. There was no warning shot. The crack of the rifle split the world in half. Josiah's shoulder snapped back, blood blooming red against the snow. He dropped the gun, fell to one knee, groaning in pain and disbelief. Mabel lowered her weapon. "You won't touch her again." The sheriff cursed and grabbed Josiah's collar. The third man helped pull him up, white-faced and silent. No one argued. No one protested. They turned and left the way they came, dragging rage and pride behind them like carcasses. The snow fell harder now, thick flakes drifting like ash from a fire long extinguished. Emma stood frozen, not from cold, but from the weight lifting off her chest. Bowden stepped beside her, quiet as ever. His eyes found hers. She reached for his hand. For the first time, she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. Inside, the fire waited. Later that night, they sat by it together. No words. No celebration. Just stillness. Mabel brewed tea. Bowden sanded a new carving. Emma wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and watched the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, the world had changed. Not loudly, but surely. She had stood. He had stayed. Justice hadn't shouted, but it had answered. And in the hush that followed, she whispered something that neither fire nor snow could carry away. "I'm not afraid anymore." Bowden didn't look up. "You never were," he said softly. "You just hadn't been believed." And the snow burned quiet outside. Where justice, long overdue, had finally fallen.